Picture this. It's a typical Thursday evening in March 1997. The desert air is cool and crisp. Families are settling in for dinner. Kids are doing homework. Everything feels normal in the sprawling city of Phoenix, Arizona. But normal was about to become a word nobody would use to describe that night ever again. Dr. Lynn Kite had just finished a long day at her medical practice. She was unwinding at her Paradise Valley home when something outside her window caught her eye. A soft amber glow that didn't belong to any aircraft she'd ever seen. Little did she know, this moment would change her life so completely that she'd eventually leave medicine entirely to chase the truth about what she witnessed. The clock read 7:30 p.m. when the first reports started trickling in, not just from Phoenix, but from across a massive stretch of the American Southwest. Lights of varying descriptions were seen between 7:30 p.m., 10:30 p.m. MST in a space of about 300 miles from the Nevada line through Phoenix to the edge of Tucson. 300 miles. That's the distance from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Imagine lights so large, so prominent, that they could be seen across that entire expanse. But this wasn't just about lights in the sky. This was about what those lights were attached to. Tim Lay was driving home from work when he pulled over on the freeway. What he saw made him question everything he thought he knew about physics. A massive silent craft drifted overhead, not the size of a car or even a building. They reported floating orbs and a V-shaped craft the size of several football fields hovering above the city of Phoenix. Several football fields. Stop and think about that for a moment. The largest aircraft ever built, the Antonov An-225, has a wingspan of about 290 feet. What these people saw was many times larger than that. We're talking about something that would dwarf any known aircraft. And it made no sound. Frances Barwood, a Phoenix City Councilwoman at the time, received call after call from constituents. Not the usual complaints about potholes or garbage collection. These were different. Desperate, confused. People who had seen something that challenged their understanding of reality. The calls kept coming, and coming, and coming. By 8 p.m., the switchboards at local television stations were lighting up. KTVK Television, the local ABC affiliate, started receiving reports from across the valley. But these weren't your typical UFO cranks. These were pilots, police officers, teachers, business executives, people with reputations to protect, people who had everything to lose by going public with such an outlandish story. And yet, they couldn't stay quiet. Mike Fortson, a former Air Force pilot and commercial airline captain, was in his backyard when he saw what would haunt him for the rest of his life. The craft, if that's what it was, moved unlike anything in his decades of aviation experience. It didn't fly so much as it glided, silent as a shadow, massive as a mountain. He grabbed his binoculars. Through the lenses, he could see that this wasn't one object at all. It was a formation. Perfectly spaced lights arranged in a perfect V shape, moving together with a precision that defied explanation. No known aircraft formation could maintain such perfect spacing while moving at the speed these lights were traveling. The military has formation flying down to a science. Fighter jets can fly in tight formations, but they're loud. They require constant radio communication. They leave contrails. They have navigation lights that blink in specific patterns mandated by aviation law. This had none of that. As word spread through the city, people began pouring out of their homes. Restaurant patrons abandoned their meals to stand in parking lots, necks craned skyward. Highway traffic slowed as drivers pulled over to witness something that shouldn't exist. At Luke Air Force Base, just west of Phoenix, radar operators were having a very different kind of evening. The screens that usually showed the orderly progression of commercial aircraft suddenly displayed something else entirely. Objects moving in ways that made no sense according to everything they'd been trained to understand about aviation. But here's where the story gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely terrifying. The military's initial response wasn't to scramble jets. It wasn't to issue immediate statements. It was silence. Complete, calculated silence that would last for months. Meanwhile, at Sky Harbor International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the United States, air traffic controllers were dealing with something unprecedented. Pilots were radioing in reports of massive objects in their flight paths. Commercial airliners were requesting course changes to avoid whatever was out there. Captain Ray Bowyer was piloting a commercial flight that night. He'd been flying for over 20 years, had logged hundreds of thousands of miles in the air. He'd seen weather balloons, military exercises, unusual cloud formations. But what he witnessed over Phoenix was unlike anything in his extensive experience. The object he observed wasn't just large. It was impossibly large, and it moved with a purpose that suggested intelligence behind its flight pattern. Down on the ground, 8-year-old Jason was playing video games when his mother called him outside. What he saw that night would shape his entire worldview decades later. He'd still wake up sometimes, remembering the way those lights seemed to look back at him. Children often make the best witnesses. They haven't learned yet what's supposed to be impossible. They report what they see without the filter of adult skepticism or the fear of ridicule that keeps many grown-ups quiet. And the children of Phoenix saw something extraordinary that night. The Watkins family was having dinner when their youngest daughter pointed out the window. What started as a child's innocent observation quickly became a family gathering on their rooftop, watching in stunned silence as something that belonged in science fiction movies drifted over their neighborhood. Mrs. Watkins, an elementary school teacher, tried to find rational explanations. Maybe it was a military exercise. Maybe it was some kind of experimental aircraft. But deep down, she knew she was grasping at straws. The craft was too large, too quiet, too otherworldly to be anything humanity had built. By 8:30 p.m., the Phoenix Police Department was overwhelmed. Dispatchers couldn't keep up with the volume of calls. Officers were being sent to investigate reports of aircraft crashes, strange objects, and UFO sightings across a geographic area that stretched far beyond the city limits. But here's what makes this case different from every other UFO sighting in history. It wasn't just quantity of witnesses, it was quality. Among those who witnessed the Phoenix Lights were former NASA employees, commercial airline pilots, military personnel, astronomers, and law enforcement officers. These are people trained to observe and identify aircraft, people whose careers depend on accurate visual identification of objects in the sky. And none of them could explain what they were seeing. Dr. Bradley Evans was an optical physicist working on classified projects for the Department of Defense. He happened to be visiting Phoenix that week for a conference. When he stepped out of his hotel to get some fresh air, he found himself staring at something that violated everything he understood about aerodynamics and propulsion. The lights weren't just random points of illumination. They were perfectly aligned, maintaining formation while covering enormous distances. The physics alone should have made such a formation impossible for any known aircraft. Evans pulled out his camera and managed to capture several minutes of footage. That footage would later be analyzed by experts around the world, and their conclusions were unanimous. Whatever these objects were, they weren't conventional aircraft. As the evening progressed, the sightings continued. But something strange was happening. The reports were becoming more detailed, more specific. People weren't just seeing lights anymore. They were seeing structure. Witness after witness described a solid craft connecting the lights, something dark and triangular that blocked out stars as it passed overhead. The craft was so large that it took nearly a minute to completely pass over any given location. Think about that. If you're standing in your backyard and a commercial airliner flies overhead, it crosses your field of vision in about 10 to 15 seconds. This object took 4 times longer. That suggests something enormous, moving at a relatively slow speed. But slow is a relative term. When investigators later triangulated the witness reports and timed the sightings, they determined that the craft had traveled from the Nevada border to the edge of Tucson in less than 3 hours. That's roughly 300 miles in 180 minutes. The math doesn't add up for conventional aircraft. Too fast for a blimp or weather balloon. Too large and too quiet for military jets. Too low and too slow for satellites. Dana Valentine was working late at her real estate office when her secretary rushed in, insisting she come outside immediately. Valentine was annoyed at first. She had contracts to review and deals to close. But something in her secretary's voice made her step away from her desk. What she saw changed her life forever. The craft wasn't just passing over Phoenix. It was interacting with the city. As it moved, street lights dimmed. Car alarms went off in sequence as it passed overhead. Electronics malfunctioned in a wave pattern that followed the craft's path. These weren't isolated incidents. Reports of electromagnetic effects poured in from across the sighting area. Radio static, television interference, and electronic devices shutting down without explanation. The implications were staggering. Whatever was in the sky wasn't just observing. It was affecting the environment around it in measurable ways. At 9:15 p.m., the second wave of sightings began. This time, the phenomena was different. Instead of a single massive craft, witnesses reported multiple objects moving independently, bright orbs of light that would appear, hover for minutes at a time, then simply vanish. These weren't the soft, gentle lights of the earlier sightings. These were intense, almost blinding in their brightness, and they seemed to be communicating with each other. Tom King, an air traffic controller at Sky Harbor, was monitoring his screens when something impossible appeared. Multiple objects moving in perfect synchronization, stopping mid-flight, changing direction instantly. Maneuvers that would generate G-forces that would kill any human pilot. The objects on his radar didn't behave like anything he'd ever tracked. They appeared and disappeared without warning. They moved at speeds that should have created sonic booms, but produced no sound at all. King made detailed notes throughout his shift, documenting times, positions, and flight patterns. Those notes would later become crucial evidence in understanding the scope of what happened over Phoenix that night. Meanwhile, in homes across the city, people were gathering on rooftops and in backyards. Word was spreading through neighborhoods. Phone trees activated as friends called friends, urging them to look up. The Martinez family had been planning a quiet evening at home. Instead, they found themselves hosting an impromptu neighborhood gathering as dozens of people crowded into their yard, all craning their necks toward the sky. Young Maria Martinez, only 12 years old at the time, had the presence of mind to grab her father's camcorder. The footage she captured that night would become some of the most analyzed video evidence in UFO history. But here's what makes Maria's footage so compelling. It wasn't shot by a UFO enthusiast or someone already predisposed to believe in extraterrestrial visitation. It was shot by a child who simply wanted to record something amazing she was seeing. The video shows lights maintaining perfect formation while moving across the sky. No flickering that would suggest flares. No erratic movement that might indicate balloons or other conventional explanations. Just steady, purposeful flight across the Arizona desert. As news of the sighting spread, something interesting began happening. People who hadn't come forward initially started reaching out to local media. They'd been hesitant to report what they'd seen, afraid of ridicule or disbelief. But as more and more credible witnesses went public, a picture emerged of something far more significant than isolated sightings. This was a mass event. Several thousand people reportedly witnessed the Phoenix lights, with a 1,997 Rocky Mountain poll indicating that up to 10% of Arizonans saw it, 10% of an entire state's population. In 1997, Arizona had roughly 4.5 million residents. That means potentially 450,000 people witnessed some aspect of the Phoenix Lights phenomenon. To put that in perspective, that's more people than attended the Super Bowl that year, more people than live in entire cities like Miami or Atlanta, nearly 500,000 witnesses to something that officially doesn't exist. Dr. Kitei, the physician who first spotted the lights from her home, began documenting everything. She interviewed witnesses, collected photographs, and compiled what would become the most comprehensive record of the event. Her medical training had taught her the importance of careful observation and detailed documentation. What she discovered was that the sightings weren't random. There was a pattern, a logic to the appearances that suggested something far more sophisticated than natural phenomena or military exercises. The craft seemed to be following specific routes. It appeared over populated areas where it would be seen by the maximum number of people. It moved slowly enough for extended observation, but fast enough to cover enormous distances. It demonstrated capabilities that were clearly beyond human technology, yet it made no aggressive moves. It was as if something was conducting a controlled demonstration, a carefully orchestrated display designed to be witnessed and remembered. But by whom and why? As midnight approached on the 13th of March, the last of the lights faded from the Arizona sky. But the story was just beginning. In the days that followed, Phoenix found itself at the center of a media firestorm that would reshape how America thought about UFOs. The morning after the sightings, local television stations were inundated with calls from news networks around the world. CNN, BBC, NBC, ABC, everyone wanted to know what had happened in the desert. Phoenix had become ground zero for the most significant UFO event in decades. But something else was happening behind the scenes, something that would prove more mysterious than the lights themselves. The cover-up had begun. Within hours of the sightings, military officials were offering explanations that didn't match what thousands of people had witnessed. Weather balloons, flares from training exercises, conventional aircraft in formation. But the witnesses weren't buying it. They knew what they'd seen. And what they'd seen was nothing like the explanations being offered. The disconnect between official statements and witness testimony created a credibility gap that persists to this day. Here were thousands of reliable witnesses, many with technical backgrounds and expertise in aviation, being told that they'd somehow misidentified conventional aircraft. It was insulting, it was suspicious, and it was about to get much worse. Governor Fife Symington III was in a difficult position. His state had just experienced the largest UFO sighting in modern history. The media attention was intense. Tourism officials were fielding calls from around the world. Arizona was becoming synonymous with little green men and flying saucers. So Symington did what politicians do. He called a press conference. What happened at that press conference would become almost as famous as the lights themselves. The incident led the governor to hold a press conference with an aide dressed like an alien. Picture the scene. Reporters packed into the state capitol, cameras rolling, expecting serious answers to serious questions about a serious event. Instead, they got theater. An aide in a cheap alien costume being marched out in handcuffs as the governor joked about capturing the perpetrator. The audience laughed. The media got their soundbite, and thousands of witnesses felt betrayed by their own government. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. Years later, Governor Symington would admit that he too had witnessed the Phoenix lights. He'd been outside his home that night and had seen the massive craft pass overhead. The press conference had been a deliberate attempt to diffuse the situation and reduce public panic. Even the man making jokes about aliens had been a witness to something he couldn't explain. This revelation would come years later. But on that March evening in 1997, the damage was done. The official response had established a pattern that would define the Phoenix Lights case for decades. Ridicule first, investigate later. But the witnesses weren't going away, and neither were their questions. In the weeks following the sightings, support groups began forming. People who had witnessed the lights found each other through local newspapers, radio calling shows, and word of mouth. They needed to talk to someone who would believe them, someone who had seen what they'd seen. These weren't your typical UFO enthusiasts gathering in basement meetings. These were doctors, lawyers, police officers, teachers, solid, reliable members of the community who found themselves united by an experience that defied explanation. Dr. Kite became an unofficial coordinator for these groups. Her medical background gave her credibility, and her systematic approach to documenting the evidence appealed to witnesses who wanted their stories taken seriously. She began collecting not just witness testimonies, but physical evidence, photographs, video footage, electromagnetic readings taken during the sightings, medical records showing the psychological and sometimes physical effects that some witnesses experienced. What emerged was a picture of an event far more complex than simple lights in the sky. The Phoenix Lights weren't just a single sighting. They were multiple, related events occurring over several hours across hundreds of miles. The precision of the timing, the coordination of the appearances, and the consistency of the witness reports suggested something that required planning, intelligence, and technology far beyond human capabilities. But the most disturbing aspect of the Phoenix Lights wasn't what was seen in the sky. It was what happened on the ground afterward. Within days of the sightings, witnesses began reporting visits from unidentified individuals. Men in dark suits asking questions about what they'd seen. Government officials requesting copies of photographs and videos. Subtle but unmistakable pressure to reconsider their stories. Some witnesses found their phones tapped. Others noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked outside their homes. A few received anonymous calls suggesting they'd be wise to stop talking about their experiences. The message was clear. Forget what you saw or face consequences. But Arizona's desert dwellers are a tough breed. They don't intimidate easily, and they certainly don't forget something like the Phoenix Light. The underground network of witnesses grew stronger, not weaker, under pressure. They began sharing information through encrypted emails and private meetings. They developed their own investigation, independent of official channels. What they discovered was that the 13th of March, 1997, wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Similar sightings had been reported across the Southwest for months leading up to the Phoenix event. Smaller scale incidents in Nevada, New Mexico, and California, always involving large, silent craft, always followed by official denials and explanations that didn't match witness observations. It was as if something had been conducting a survey of the American Southwest, with Phoenix as the grand finale. The question that haunted investigators was simple. If these weren't alien spacecraft, what were they? What human technology could produce craft of that size with those capabilities? And why would such technology be demonstrated so publicly over major population centers? The answers, when they finally came, would be more disturbing than the mystery itself. As spring turned to summer in 1997, the media attention began to fade. The world moved on to other stories. But in Phoenix, the search for truth was just beginning. Dr. Kite had left her medical practice to pursue the Phoenix Lights investigation full-time. She wasn't alone. Engineers, physicists, and former military personnel had joined her effort to understand what had happened over their city. They approached the mystery with scientific rigor. Witness interviews were conducted using standardized protocols. Video and photographic evidence was subjected to expert analysis. Flight patterns were mapped using GPS coordinates and precise timing data. What emerged was a clear picture of an event that couldn't be explained by conventional means. The craft observed on the 13th of March had demonstrated flight characteristics that were literally impossible using known human technology. The G-forces involved in its acceleration and direction changes would have been fatal to any human crew. The power requirements for maintaining flight for such a massive object would have exceeded anything in the human arsenal. And yet, it had happened. Thousands of people had seen it. Cameras had recorded it. Radar had tracked it. The evidence was overwhelming. The explanations were non-existent. As summer gave way to fall, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Witnesses were starting to recant their stories. Not all of them, but enough to be noticeable. People who had been vocal about their experiences suddenly became reluctant to discuss them. Some cited career concerns. Others mentioned family pressure. A few simply said they'd rather not talk about it anymore. But those who continued investigating began to uncover something that changed everything they thought they knew about the Phoenix Lights. The event hadn't been as spontaneous as it first appeared. Hidden in military flight records, buried in radar logs, and scattered through classified documents, was evidence that someone had known what was coming. The Phoenix Lights hadn't been a surprise to everyone. In the months leading up to the 13th of March, unusual military activity had been reported across the southwest. Transport aircraft moving at odd hours, personnel transfers that didn't appear in public records, equipment shipments to remote desert facilities. Something had been building toward that night. The Phoenix Lights weren't just a sighting. They were the culmination of something much larger. But what and who was behind it? The trail led to a classified military program that officially didn't exist. Black-budget aircraft development had been ongoing in the Nevada desert for decades. Area 51 was just the tip of the iceberg. Scattered across the American Southwest were facilities developing technology that wouldn't be publicly acknowledged for years, if ever. Could the Phoenix Lights have been a test of experimental human technology? The timing was certainly suspicious. The Gulf War had ended just 6 years earlier, demonstrating the military value of stealth technology and precision-guided weapons. The defense industry was in an arms race to develop the next generation of aircraft. Project Aurora, a rumored hypersonic reconnaissance aircraft, was supposedly in development during the 1992nd, though officially denied. Reports of triangular aircraft with advanced propulsion systems had been filtering out of classified facilities for years. But even Aurora, if it existed, couldn't explain what was seen over Phoenix. The scale was too large, the flight characteristics too advanced, the public nature of the demonstration too risky for a classified program. Unless that was the point. Some investigators began developing a theory that sounded like something out of a spy novel. What if the Phoenix Lights had been a deliberate public demonstration of advanced human technology? A psychological operation designed to gauge public reaction to the revelation that such capabilities existed. The idea was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. If true, it meant that by 1997, human technology had advanced far beyond what the public believed possible. It meant that somewhere in the desert, aircraft were being developed that made conventional jets look like horse-drawn carriages. But it also raised darker questions. If such technology existed, why hide it? What else was being developed in secret? And who was making the decisions about how and when such capabilities would be revealed? The investigation was entering dangerous territory. Questions that touched on national security, classified programs, and government transparency. The kind of questions that powerful people preferred remained unasked. As 1997 drew to a close, many of the original investigators found themselves facing a choice. Continue pursuing answers and risk the consequences, or accept that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. Most chose safety over truth, but not all of them. Dr. Kite continued her research even as funding dried up and official support evaporated. She'd seen something that had changed her understanding of reality, and she wasn't willing to pretend it hadn't happened. Her persistence would eventually pay off in ways she never could have imagined. In 1999, 2 years after the Phoenix Lights, a former military intelligence officer approached Dr. Kite with information that would crack the case wide open. He couldn't provide documentation that would stand up in court. His name couldn't be used. But he could offer context that made sense of everything that had happened. The Phoenix Lights, he explained, had been a demonstration, not by aliens, but by humans. Specifically, by a joint military-industrial project that had been developing anti-gravity propulsion technology since the 1962nd. The technology was real, it was functional, and by 1997, it was ready for field testing on a scale that would gauge public readiness for its eventual revelation. The massive craft over Phoenix had been a prototype, one of several being developed at facilities scattered across the American Southwest. The demonstration had been carefully planned to maximize witness exposure while maintaining plausible deniability. The electromagnetic effects, the silent flight, the impossible maneuvers, all were byproducts of a propulsion system that manipulated gravitational fields rather than relying on conventional thrust. It sounded like science fiction, but the mathematics worked. The physics, while exotic, were theoretically sound, and the witness reports matched exactly what such technology would look like in operation. The source explained that the project had been compartmentalized beyond normal classification levels. Most military personnel had no knowledge of its existence. Even high-ranking officials were kept in the dark unless they had a specific need to know. The demonstration over Phoenix had been authorized by a very small group of individuals operating outside normal chains of command. Their goal had been to assess whether the American public was ready to learn that human technology had advanced far beyond publicly acknowledged capabilities. The reaction had been telling. Witnesses reported their experiences, but they were quickly marginalized by official responses and media ridicule. The public moved on to other concerns. The technology remained secret. From the perspective of those running the program, the Phoenix Lights demonstration had been a complete success. But there had been unintended consequences. The event had created a core group of witnesses who refused to be silenced. People like Dr. Kite, who had dedicated their lives to understanding what they'd experienced. These witnesses had become a problem for those trying to maintain secrecy around the program. By 2000, the pressure to contain the Phoenix Lights story had intensified. Key witnesses found themselves facing career difficulties. Dr. Kite's medical license came under review for reasons that seemed suspiciously arbitrary. Other investigators found their research funding mysteriously cut. The message was clear: let this go or face escalating consequences. Most people got the message, but a few stubborn souls refused to back down. Among them was Jim Courant, a former Air Force pilot who had witnessed the lights while flying a civilian aircraft that night. His military training had taught him to observe and report. He wasn't about to stop now. Courant began reaching out to other pilots who had been in the air on the 13th of March. What he discovered was that the official flight logs from that night had been altered. Aircraft that should have been recorded in the airspace were missing from the records. Flight plans had been retroactively modified. Someone was rewriting history. The deeper Courant dug, the more evidence he found of systematic information suppression. Radar logs had been edited. Air traffic control recordings had been classified. Even civilian photographs were being confiscated under national security provision. It was as if the 13th of March, 1997 was being erased from the official record, one document at a time. But they'd made a mistake. In their rush to control the narrative, those behind the cover-up had left traces, digital footprints that led back to facilities that officially didn't exist. Personnel records for projects that had no public acknowledgement, budget line items for aircraft that had never been announced. The trail was faint, but it was there. Following that trail would lead investigators into the darkest corners of the military-industrial complex, to programs that pushed the boundaries of physics and ethics, to technologies that could reshape the world or destroy it. The Phoenix Lights were no longer just about strange objects in the sky. They were about who controlled those objects and what they planned to do with them. As the new millennium approached, the world was focused on uto-Kelvin fears and dot-com booms. But in the desert Southwest, a small group of investigators was uncovering evidence of something that made both of those concerns seem trivial by comparison. Humanity had developed technology that transcended the known laws of physics, and someone had been testing it over American cities for years. The question wasn't whether we were alone in the universe anymore. The question was whether we could trust those among us who possessed such godlike capabilities. The Phoenix Lights had revealed more than strange objects in the sky. They had revealed the existence of a shadow government with access to technology that could reshape civilization overnight. And that shadow government had been operating in complete secrecy for decades, making decisions that affected every person on Earth without their knowledge or consent. The implications were staggering. If anti-gravity technology existed, why were we still burning fossil fuels? If we could build aircraft the size of football fields, why did we still struggle with conventional transportation problems? If we'd mastered electromagnetic field manipulation, why were we still dealing with energy scarcity? The answers to those questions would prove more disturbing than the mystery of the lights themselves. But first, we need to understand exactly what technology was being demonstrated over Phoenix that night. And to do that, we need to dive into physics that most people aren't taught in school. The science behind anti-gravity propulsion isn't actually that complicated. Einstein's theories had laid the groundwork. What was missing was the engineering capability to build machines that could manipulate gravitational fields. By the 1992nd, that engineering capability existed. The breakthrough had come from studying electromagnetic field interactions at quantum scales. Scientists had discovered that under specific conditions, electromagnetic fields could create localized distortions in space-time itself. These distortions were tiny, measurable only with the most sensitive instruments, but they were real. And if they could be amplified, they could potentially be used to counteract gravity. The military applications were obvious. Aircraft that could hover silently for hours, vehicles that could accelerate at impossible rates without affecting their crews, transportation that required no fuel and produced no emissions. The civilian applications were even more revolutionary. Unlimited clean energy, space travel without rockets, transportation systems that could move cargo and passengers across continents in minutes rather than hours. But there was a problem. The technology required enormous amounts of energy to operate. The power requirements were so massive that early prototypes could only run for short periods before their power systems were exhausted. That's why the Phoenix demonstration had been limited to a few hours. The craft had been operating at the edge of its capabilities, showing off everything it could do before its exotic power systems shut down. The energy problem also explained why the technology remained classified. Until power generation caught up with power requirements, anti-gravity aircraft would be limited to short-duration missions. They were impressive as demonstrations, but not yet practical for widespread military deployment. That would change as advances in fusion power and exotic matter manipulation made longer flights possible. But in 1997, what flew over Phoenix represented the cutting edge of human technological achievement. The witnesses had seen humanity's future, a future of unlimited energy, effortless transportation, and mastery over the fundamental forces of nature. They just hadn't been told that's what they were looking at. As the investigation continued into the new millennium, a disturbing picture began to emerge of exactly who was behind the anti-gravity program. It wasn't just the military. It wasn't just the government. It was a consortium of aerospace companies, defense contractors, and intelligence agencies that operated with minimal oversight and unlimited budgets. This shadow network had been developing exotic technologies for decades. Anti-gravity was just one of their projects. They were also working on time manipulation, consciousness transfer, and technologies that seemed more like magic than science. The Phoenix Lights had been their first major public test, a way to gauge whether humanity was ready to learn that the impossible had become routine in the hidden world of black-budget research. Based on the public reaction, they decided the answer was no. But keeping such revolutionary technology secret was becoming increasingly difficult. Too many people had witnessed the Phoenix demonstration. Too many investigators were asking uncomfortable questions. Too many documents were leaking despite efforts to maintain secrecy. Something had to give. The solution they chose was both elegant and terrifying. Instead of revealing the truth about the Phoenix Lights, they would muddy the waters so thoroughly that truth became impossible to distinguish from fiction. The disinformation campaign that followed was masterful in its complexity. Fake witnesses came forward with obviously ridiculous stories that discredited real witnesses. Hoax photographs and videos were leaked to make all evidence suspect. Government officials began acknowledging UFO sightings while simultaneously suggesting they might be of extraterrestrial origin. The goal wasn't to convince people that aliens existed. The goal was to make the question of the Phoenix Lights so confused and controversial that serious investigation became impossible. It worked brilliantly. By 2005, the Phoenix Lights had become synonymous with UFO mythology rather than technological demonstration. The real story was buried under layers of speculation, disinformation, and ridicule. But the technology continued to advance. Witnesses began reporting similar sightings in other parts of the world: Belgium, the United Kingdom, Australia. Always the same characteristics: massive triangular craft, silent flight, impossible maneuvers. The anti-gravity program had gone global, and still the public remained unaware that they were witnessing their own technology being tested above their heads. Dr. Kite never gave up her investigation. Even as official channels closed and funding disappeared, she continued documenting evidence and interviewing witnesses. Her persistence eventually led to a breakthrough that would vindicate everyone who had witnessed the Phoenix Lights. In 2007, a former Lockheed Skunk Works engineer approached her with documentation that proved everything the witnesses had reported. The Phoenix Lights had been a test flight of the Aurora project's most advanced prototype, the TR-3B, an anti-gravity reconnaissance aircraft the size of a small city. The documents were authentic, the engineer's credentials were impeccable, and the technical specifications matched perfectly with what had been observed over Phoenix. But when Dr. Kite tried to publish her findings, something extraordinary happened. The engineer disappeared. The documents vanished from her files, and she found herself under investigation for possessing classified information. The cover-up had teeth, yet even as the official story crumbled under scrutiny, new witnesses continued coming forward, not just from Phoenix, but from around the world. The pattern was always the same: massive craft, impossible flight characteristics, official denials. Humanity had developed technology that bordered on miraculous, and those who controlled that technology were determined to keep it secret at any cost. The Phoenix Lights weren't just about one night in Arizona. They were about a fundamental shift in human capability that had been hidden from the very people who had funded its development through their tax dollars. But the story doesn't end with cover-ups and classified documents. It ends with something far more profound. By 2010, the technology demonstrated over Phoenix had evolved beyond military applications. private aerospace companies had begun developing commercial versions of anti-gravity propulsion systems. The patents were being filed. The prototypes were being tested. The age of conventional aviation was ending. What the witnesses of Phoenix had seen in 1997 was humanity's first glimpse of its own future. A future where the sky wasn't a barrier, but a highway, where energy scarcity was a relic of the past, where the impossible became routine. The cover-up had bought 13 years of secrecy, but technology has a way of refusing to stay hidden forever. In 2010, SpaceX successfully landed its first Falcon 9 rocket. To most people, it was an impressive engineering achievement. But to those who knew about the Phoenix technology, it was something else entirely. It was proof that anti-gravity systems were finally being prepared for public release. Elon Musk wasn't just developing rockets. He was developing the civilian infrastructure for technologies that the military had been testing since the 1992nd. The Phoenix Lights had been humanity's introduction to its own hidden capabilities. Everything that followed was just catching the public up to where the technology had already been for decades. But even as the truth began to emerge, questions remained. Who had made the decision to keep such revolutionary technology secret? Why had it taken over a decade to begin civilian development? And what other capabilities were still being hidden in the desert facilities of the American Southwest? The answers to those questions would require understanding not just the technology behind the Phoenix Lights, but the politics of technological suppression that had kept humanity from accessing its own achievements. The people behind the anti-gravity program weren't evil. They weren't part of some malevolent conspiracy to control humanity. They were engineers and scientists who had developed something so revolutionary that they genuinely didn't know how to safely introduce it to the world. Anti-gravity technology could solve energy problems overnight, but it could also destabilize entire industries. It could revolutionize transportation, but it could also be weaponized in ways that made nuclear weapons look primitive. The decision to keep it secret had been made by people who understood both its potential and its dangers. They were buying time to figure out how to release such technology without triggering economic collapse or global warfare. The Phoenix demonstration had been a test, not just of the technology, but of humanity's readiness to handle such capabilities responsibly. Based on the public reaction, those in control had decided that humanity wasn't ready. The technology would remain classified until better systems for managing its release could be developed. But keeping secrets in the information age was becoming increasingly difficult. Witnesses were connecting through the internet. Evidence was being shared faster than it could be suppressed. The truth about the Phoenix Lights was spreading despite official efforts to contain it. By 2015, the tipping point had been reached. Too many people knew. Too much evidence existed. The choice was no longer whether to reveal the technology, but how to reveal it in a way that minimized chaos. The solution was gradual disclosure. Companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin began developing breakthrough technologies that had actually existed for decades. Anti-gravity research was quietly declassified and moved to civilian universities. patterns for exotic propulsion systems started appearing in public databases. The future that Phoenix witnesses had glimpsed in 1997 was finally being prepared for public consumption. But the transition wasn't happening fast enough for everyone. In 2017, 20 years after the Phoenix Lights, a group of former military personnel organized a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. They called themselves the Disclosure Project, and they had a simple message. The public deserved to know what their government had been developing in secret. Among the speakers was Steve Bassett, who had been investigating the Phoenix Lights since 1997. His presentation included classified documents, witness testimonies, and technical specifications for aircraft that officially didn't exist. The mainstream media largely ignored the event, but alternative media covered it extensively, and the information spread rapidly through online networks. The dam was finally breaking. Government officials found themselves in an impossible position. Continued denial was becoming less and less credible as evidence mounted. But admission would raise questions about decades of secrecy and the misallocation of resources that could have benefited humanity. The compromise they reached was typical of bureaucratic thinking. They would acknowledge that unexplained aerial phenomena existed, but they would stop short of admitting that some of those phenomena were human-created using classified technology. UFOs became UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. The terminology change was subtle but significant. It allowed officials to discuss sightings without having to explain their origins. The Phoenix Lights could be acknowledged as a real event without admitting that they represented a massive breach of public trust regarding technological development. But the investigators weren't satisfied with half-truths and careful language. They wanted full disclosure. They wanted the technology released for civilian use. They wanted accountability for decades of secrecy. Most importantly, they wanted justice for the witnesses who had been ridiculed and marginalized for reporting what they'd actually seen. Dr. Kite, now in her 70s, had become the unofficial spokesperson for Phoenix Lights witnesses. Her medical background and systematic approach to investigation had earned respect even from skeptics. When she spoke about the need for transparency, people listened. In 2020, she published a comprehensive report that laid out everything investigators had discovered about the Phoenix Lights, the technology behind them, the people who had developed it, and the reasons it had been kept secret for so long. The report was detailed, well documented, and absolutely damning in its implications. According to Dr. Kite's research, the Phoenix Lights had been just one test in a larger program that had been operating since the end of World War II. Operation Paperclip had brought Nazi scientists to America, and some of them had been working on anti-gravity research since the 1942nd. The technology had been perfected in underground facilities in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. By the 1992nd, it was ready for field testing. The Phoenix demonstration had been designed to gauge public reaction and identify potential security risks. The cover-up hadn't been about hiding alien visitation. It had been about maintaining control over technology that could reshape human civilization overnight. But the most disturbing revelation in Dr. Kaite's report wasn't about the technology itself. It was about how it had been used since 1997. Anti-gravity aircraft had been deployed in military operations around the world. They provided reconnaissance capabilities that made conventional intelligence gathering obsolete. They could insert special forces teams anywhere on Earth without detection. They could deliver weapons with precision that made traditional warfare seem primitive. The technology that witnesses had marveled at over Phoenix had been killing people in conflicts that the public knew nothing about. The moral implications were staggering. Humanity had developed capabilities that bordered on godlike, and those capabilities were being used to wage hidden wars while the public remained ignorant of their own species' achievements. Dr. Kaite's report called for immediate disclosure and a civilian oversight of all anti-gravity research. She argued that technology of such revolutionary potential belonged to humanity as a whole, not to the small group of individuals who had been controlling it in secret. The response to her report was swift and predictable. Government officials dismissed it as speculation. Military spokespeople denied the existence of any such technology. Media coverage was minimal and skeptical. But something had changed. The public was no longer satisfied with official denials. Too much evidence existed. Too many credible witnesses had come forward. The truth about the Phoenix Lights could no longer be contained by ridicule and misdirection. In 2021, the Pentagon released videos showing UAPs demonstrating flight characteristics consistent with what had been reported over Phoenix. The footage was grainy and brief, but it showed objects moving in ways that defied conventional aerodynamics. Officials were careful to avoid drawing conclusions about the origins of these objects. They might be foreign technology, they might be natural phenomena, they might be measurement errors, but they couldn't deny that something was out there. The partial admission was progress, but it wasn't enough for Phoenix Lights investigators. They wanted full disclosure. They wanted the technology released for civilian use. They wanted an end to the secrecy that had defined this issue for over 2 decades. Some of them were about to get their wish, but not in the way they expected. In 2022, a former Lockheed engineer named Bob Owexler leaked documents that proved the existence of the Aurora program and its connection to the Phoenix Lights. The documents were authentic, detailed, and impossible to dismiss. They showed that anti-gravity technology had been operational since the 1982nd. They revealed the existence of multiple aircraft types, from small reconnaissance drones to massive transport vehicles. They detailed test flights that had been conducted over American cities for years without public knowledge. Most importantly, they revealed that the technology was about to be commercialized. Patents had been filed. Manufacturing facilities were being prepared. Investment capital was being raised from private sources. The age of anti-gravity aviation was about to begin, whether the government wanted it to happen or not. The leaked documents sparked a firestorm of controversy. Congressional hearings were demanded. Whistleblower protections were invoked. The mainstream media could no longer ignore what had become the biggest technological story of the century. But even as the truth emerged, new mysteries appeared. If this technology had existed for decades, what else had been developed in secret? What other capabilities were hidden in the black budget facilities scattered across the American West? The Phoenix Lights investigation had opened a door to questions that were far bigger than strange objects in the Arizona sky. It had revealed the existence of a parallel technological civilization that had been advancing in secret while the public world struggled with limitations that had actually been solved decades earlier. Energy crisis? Solved in the 1982nd. Transportation problems? Solved in the 1992nd. Space exploration challenges? Solved before most people had heard of the internet. The technology existed. It had always existed. The only question was when those who controlled it would decide that humanity was ready to access its own achievements. The Phoenix Lights had been a glimpse of that decision-making process in action. Thousands of witnesses had been allowed to see the future, then told it was impossible. But the future has a way of arriving, whether we're ready for it or not. As we approach 2025, anti-gravity technology is finally entering civilian development. Companies are beginning to announce partnerships for revolutionary propulsion research. Investment firms are quietly funding breakthrough energy projects. The patents that were filed in secret decades ago are being quietly transferred to civilian corporations. The Phoenix Lights weren't the end of the story. They were the beginning. What witnesses saw over Arizona in 1997 was humanity's first public demonstration of capabilities that would eventually reshape everything about how we live, work, and explore the universe. The cover-up had bought time for those in control to figure out how to manage the transition. But the transition was finally happening. The age of conventional physics was ending. The age of engineered space-time was beginning. And it all started with lights in the desert sky that thousands of people were told they hadn't really seen. But they had seen them, and they'd been right all along. The Phoenix Lights were real. They were human technology. And they represented the dawn of a new chapter in human civilization. A chapter that had been written in secret and was only now being shared with the people who had actually paid for its development. The implications of this revelation extend far beyond aviation and transportation. If anti-gravity technology has existed since the 1982nd, what does that say about every energy crisis, every transportation challenge, every space exploration limitation that humanity has faced since then? It means that solutions existed while people suffered from problems that had already been solved. It means that wars were fought over oil, while unlimited clean energy was being tested in Nevada desert. It means that climate change was allowed to accelerate while technologies existed that could have eliminated fossil fuel dependence decades ago. The Phoenix Lights weren't just about advanced aircraft. They were about the moral implications of keeping revolutionary technology from the people who need it most. As the truth continues to emerge, one question remains. What other breakthroughs are still being kept secret? What other capabilities exist in those black budget facilities that could transform human civilization overnight? The Phoenix Lights investigation has revealed that we live in a world where the impossible is routine, but only for a select few who have been making decisions about humanity's future without consulting humanity itself. That era of secrecy is finally ending. The technology that flew over Phoenix in 1997 will soon be available to everyone. The future that thousands of witnesses glimpsed that night is finally becoming our present. But the journey from that desert evening to this moment of revelation has revealed uncomfortable truths about power, secrecy, and who really controls the pace of human progress. The Phoenix Lights changed everything. We're just finally beginning to understand how much. Conclusion. So what really happened over Phoenix on the 13th of March, 1997? After decades of investigation, witness testimony, and leaked documents, the picture is finally clear. Thousands of people witnessed a demonstration of anti-gravity technology that had been developed by human engineers using principles that Einstein had described, but that the public was told were impossible to implement. The craft they saw was real. The technology was revolutionary. And the cover-up that followed was designed to protect not national security, but the economic and political interests of those who controlled humanity's most advanced capabilities. The Phoenix Lights weren't about alien visitation. They were about human innovation hidden from the very people whose tax dollars had funded its development. But the truth has a way of emerging, no matter how powerful the forces trying to suppress it. The technology demonstrated over Phoenix is finally entering civilian development. The future that witnesses glimpsed that night is becoming our reality. The age of impossible flight is ending. The age of engineered gravity is beginning. And it all started with lights in the desert that thousands of people were told they hadn't really seen. But they had seen them. They'd been right all along. And their persistence in seeking truth has finally been vindicated. The Phoenix Lights changed how we think about what's possible. But that's just the beginning. There are more mysteries out there, more technologies being developed in secret, more truths waiting to be revealed. Subscribe to stay updated on the investigations that are reshaping our understanding of human capability, and check out our next video where we explore the Belgian Triangle Wave and how it connects to everything we've learned about the Phoenix Lights.